Sylvester Stallone gave up his first-class seat for a veteran, but what followed left the entire plane in stunned silence. Los Angeles International Airport was alive with movement. Passengers rushed past one another, some dragging luggage, others juggling coffee cups and boarding passes. Among them was Sylvester Stallone, dressed in dark jeans, a fitted jacket, and aviator sunglasses resting low on his nose. He had flown countless times before, but this flight would be unlike any other. As he walked through the terminal, few people noticed him. Travelers were too absorbed in their own journeys to recognize the Hollywood star. He preferred it that way: no cameras, no autograph requests, just a quiet moment before a long trip. At gate 47, he handed his boarding pass to the attendant, gave a polite nod, and stepped onto the jet bridge. First class was already half full, a quiet, refined crowd that enjoyed luxury without flaunting it. He slid into seat 2A, stretching out, watching the steady stream of passengers boarding. Then he noticed him. An elderly man, likely in his late 70s, carefully navigating the narrow aisle. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the overhead bins for support. A worn duffel bag, its edges frayed from years of use, hung heavily at his side. On his head sat a cap embroidered with a Vietnam War veteran's emblem. A flight attendant noticed him as well, stepping forward. "Sir, can I assist you?" The veteran waved her off. "I got it, sweetheart," he said, his voice rough, seasoned by time. Passengers in business class watched in silence as he slowly made his way down the aisle. Some averted their eyes, pretending not to notice. Others stole quick glances before returning to their screens, books, or headphones. But Stallone didn't look away. He saw it all the way. The old man winced with each step, how the weight of his bag pulled him down, how his knees barely supported him. The veteran was heading toward the back all the way to economy. Stallone didn't hesitate. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stood up, and gestured to a flight attendant. "Give him my seat." The veteran wasn't the only one who heard him. A hush fell over first class. Conversations stopped. The rustling of newspapers and the tapping of fingers on phone screens ceased. The veteran halted, his thick gray eyebrows knitting together as he turned toward the voice. Sylvester Stallone stood there, relaxed yet firm, one hand motioning toward the plush leather seat he had just vacated. "Sir," Stallone said, his voice steady, "this seat is yours." The veteran blinked, as if uncertain he had heard correctly. Then, with a dry chuckle, he shook his head. "Son, I've been in tighter spots than economy. I'll be just fine." Stallone stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You served this country. This is the least I can do." The old man studied him, his aged hands tightening around the strap of his bag. He glanced around, half expecting someone to object. But the surrounding passengers sat frozen, their eyes darting between the two men. A flight attendant stepped forward, sensing the moment. "Sir, if you'd like to take Mr. Stallone's seat, we can stow your bag up front for you as well." The veteran let out a sharp breath through his nose. Pride warred with exhaustion. His instincts told him to refuse, but his body reminded him of the pain in his legs, the stiffness in his back that never truly left. He looked at Stallone again, then at the seat. "You sure about this?" Stallone smiled. "I insist." Slowly, carefully, the veteran set his bag down and eased into the seat. As he settled, his shoulders relaxed, as if he hadn't realized just how exhausted he was. A ripple of applause swept through the cabin. Some passengers clapped politely, others more enthusiastically. The flight attendant adjusted his seatbelt with care, offering a warm smile. The old man looked up at Stallone, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. "Thank you." Stallone nodded and reached out. Their handshake was firm, steady. No more words were needed. He turned to make his way toward the back of the plane. "And now, let me ask you something. If you believe more people should hear stories like this, take a second to hit that like button." But before Stallone could take a single step, a man seated a few rows behind suddenly stood up. His face had gone pale. His eyes were locked on the veteran as if he had seen a ghost. His hands gripped the seat in front of him, knuckles white, his breath hitched, his lips parted, trying to form words, but nothing came out. The veteran frowned. "You all right, son?" Silence stretched between them. Then the man swallowed hard and took a slow step forward. And what happened next? Well, you're going to want to stick around to find out. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. What would you have done in Stallone's place? The man finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Were you in his unit?" The veteran's face shifted, his expression unreadable. He tilted his head slightly, studying the man in front of him. "Who was your father?" The man swallowed hard, taking another step forward. His throat tightened around the words. "Daniel Harrington." The moment changed. Something deeper snapped into place. The veteran's eyes widened just a flicker, but Stallone caught it. Recognition. Pain. A memory long buried. The old man's mouth opened, but for a moment no words came out. His grip tightened on the armrest, as if he suddenly needed something to hold on to. "Danny Harrington," the veteran murmured, his voice so low it was barely a whisper. He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "I'll be damned." The man's face tightened, his breath unsteady. "You knew him?" The veteran gave a small, somber nod. "Knew him?" He exhaled deeply. "Son, your father saved my life." The words sucked the air out of the cabin. Even the flight attendants had stopped what they were doing, their eyes darting between the two men. The younger man let out a shaky breath, his fingers raking through his short hair. I never met him," he admitted, his voice raw with something heavy, something unresolved. "He died before I was born." He swallowed hard. "I've spent my whole life trying to find someone who could tell me who he was." The veteran sat still, silent for a moment. Then he did something no one expected. Slowly, he reached into his worn duffel bag, his fingers searching through old fabric. After a few moments, he pulled something out, a folded, faded photograph, its edges curling with time. He turned it over, staring at it for a second, then extended it toward the man. The younger man hesitated, his fingers trembling as he took it. When he finally looked down, his breath caught in his throat. It was a photo of his father young, in uniform, standing with a group of fellow soldiers. And beside him, a much younger version of the veteran himself. The man's chest rose and fell sharply, emotion crashing over him all at once. "I've carried that for over 50 years, the veteran said, his voice hoarse. "Danny gave it to me before our last mission together." The man squeezed, his eyes shut, his shoulders shaking. The entire plane was silent, now passengers, flight attendants, even the pilot, who was listening from the open cockpit door. Stallone watched, his jaw tightening. He had given up his seat as a small gesture of kindness, but he had no idea he was setting the stage for something like this. If this story moved you even a little, take a second to hit that like button. It might seem small, but it helps bring stories like this to more people. But it wasn't over yet. The man stared down at the photograph, his fingers pressing into the worn edges as if afraid it might vanish. His breath was uneven, his chest rising and falling in slow, measured beats. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at a grainy military record or a second-hand newspaper clipping. This was real. His father young, alive, standing next to the man sitting before him. He blinked rapidly, then swallowed hard before looking up. What was he like? The veteran took a deep breath. His calloused fingers tapped against his knee as his gaze drifted past the man, past the plane back to another time, another place. Danny? He let out a small chuckle. Fearless idiot. A quiet breath of laughter rippled through the cabin, the tension breaking just slightly. Frank his name was. Frank shook his head, his eyes seeing something no one else could. He used to say the worst part of war wasn't the bullets, the bombs, or even the fear. He exhaled. It was the silence. That moment right before the fight, when everything goes still. He paused. That's when you know something's coming. The man listened intently, gripping the seat in front of him. Frank sighed through his nose. We were stationed together nearly a year. He was the kind of guy who made you believe you'd make it home, even when you knew damn well you might not. He shook his head. He never talked about fear, never let it show. He hesitated, but I knew he felt it. The younger man swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper. How did he? He couldn't finish the sentence. Frank looked away for a second, rubbing his thumb over the faded photograph in the man's hand. His voice came softer this time. We were caught in an ambush outside Pleiku. Supply route got cut off. We were sitting duck snipers, landmines, the whole nightmare package. He let out a slow breath. Danny saw me go down. A blast knocked me off my feet. I couldn't move. I was dead weight. His voice caught for just a second, then a deep breath. And your father? Frank shook his head. He didn't run. He didn't hesitate. He dragged me out of there. A sharp breath left the younger man's lips. His fingers trembled as he clutched the photograph tighter. A sharp breath left the younger man's lips. His fingers trembled as he clutched the photograph tighter. If you've made it this far, tell me in the comments though you believe in fate, because it sure seems like this moment was meant to happen. Frank's jaw tightened. He got me to safety, but before I could even catch my breath, he hesitated, his voice breaking for the first time. He swallowed hard, then forced himself to continue. I heard another round go off. I turned back. He exhaled sharply, and he was already down. The younger man squeezed his eyes shut, his entire body stiff. Frank's voice grew hoarse. I owed him my life, and the last thing I ever got to say to him was... He swallowed. Hold on, Danny. His lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't. The silence inside the plane was absolute. No one moved. No one dared. The younger man's shoulders curled inward, as if years of grief had finally caught up with him all at once. Across from him, Frank's fingers curled around his knee. He talked about you, you know, Frank said, his voice quiet but firm. Before we shipped out that day, he told me about his wife. Said she was pregnant. Said he was going to be a father. His voice turned rough with emotion. He never got to meet you, but I swear to you, Kid Hay wanted to, more than anything. The man wiped his face with the back of his hand, his body shaking under the weight of it all. Frank let out a slow breath. You were the reason he fought like hell that day. A single tear slipped past the younger man's defenses. He let out a quiet, broken laugh. 50 years, he murmured. 50 years I've been trying to find out who he was, and now in a damn airplane. He shook his head, disbelief thick in his voice. Frank gave him a knowing look. Fate's funny that way. A deep hush settled over the cabin. The passengers who had started this flight scrolling through their phones now sat frozen in their seats, watching something they knew they might never witness again. Then, just when the weight of the moment seemed like it might be too much, Stallone finally spoke. Your dad was a real-life Rocky. Frank let out a rough chuckle, swiping at his eyes. Nah, he said, shaking his head. He was tougher. The younger man let out a shaky laugh, nodding, still clutching the photo to his chest like it was the most precious thing he had ever held. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the plane would begin its descent. But no one was thinking about landing. The hum of the engines barely registered. The air inside the cabin felt different, like something bigger than all of them had just happened. The usual pre-landing routine, the seatbelt checks, the polite drink offer shad faded into something far more human. Listening, Frank Delaney let out a long breath, as if a weight he had carried for decades had finally lifted. He studied the man in front of him, the son of his best friend, the one left behind. There was so much he wanted to say, but words had never been enough, so instead he reached into his duffel bag one more time. The younger man watched in silence, unsure of what was coming next. Then Frank pulled out a small, worn notebook. The cover was scratched, the pages yellowed with time. He flipped it open carefully, his fingers trembling slightly as he turned to a page in the middle. "I've kept this since the war," he said quietly. "Wrote things down when I couldn't sleep. Letters I never got to send, names of men I never wanted to forget." He tapped the page with his finger. "Your father's in here." The younger man's breath hitched. Frank turned the notebook toward him. The ink had faded over time, but there it was. Daniel Harrington. Beneath it, a note. The younger man squinted, his eyes darting across the words, his lips parting slightly as he read them aloud. His voice was unsteady. "If I don't make it home, tell my kid I fought for him." The air inside the plane shifted again. Something deep, something unspoken passed between them. The man let out a shaky laugh, pressing a hand over his mouth, his body stiff yet trembling. He turned to Stallone, shaking his head in disbelief. "This is insane." Stallone, who had been quietly watching with his arms crossed, gave him a small smile. "I don't think it's insane at all." The younger man wiped at his eyes quickly, sniffing. "Do you mind if I—" He motioned toward the notebook. Frank hesitated for only a second, then nodded. "It's yours now." The younger man's eyes widened. His fingers hovered over the weathered pages. "You sure?" Frank let out a small chuckle. "Kid, I've been holding on to that for 50 years. It's time it went home." The younger man took it, his hands gentle as he cradled it against his chest. "Thank you," he whispered. Frank nodded. No more words were needed. Then, without warning, someone in the cabin started clapping. It was slow at first, hesitant. Then another joined in, and another, until the entire first-class section erupted into applause. Not the polite kind, but something raw, something real. People clapped for the soldier who never came home, for the son who never knew him, and for the veteran who had carried his memory for half a century. Frank looked around, his lips twitching into a small, almost embarrassed smile. "All this fuss for an old man," he muttered under his breath. Stallone grinned, leaning in slightly. "I think you earned it." The plane shuddered slightly as it prepared for landing. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that find us when we least expect it.